Dr. Sarah Buckley, thank you so much for being on Mother Freedom.
My pleasure, Emily.
You wrote the book Gentle Birth, Gentle Mothering, and you probably know this already, but your book is so popular, and many moms that I know in my world own your book and quote your book on their Instagram pages, and you are huge in the birth world.
Thank you. Yeah, it's my pleasure and privilege to share the love, really. And, a lot of my inspirations come out of my own positive experiences of giving birth. And, for lots of listeners, probably, when you've had those experiences, you really want everyone to have the best possible start as well.
Mm-hmm. And your book is just I can just read it over and over. It's always just been my go-to. Anytime I have a mama ask me questions, I just open your book and I read something out of it. And I just love how not only do you add, the studies, but you also add the evolutionary wisdom in it as well. And your experience and the spiritual side of things as
Hmm.
well, right?
Yeah, yeah. And I think when you have a baby, it's such a miracle. Like, where was the baby before they came to you? Like,
Mm-hmm.
you start asking all those questions, and that process of giving birth, however it happens, it's miraculous. And people describe it as the time when the veil between this world and the other world is very thin. It's like death, and women have had transcendental experiences at that time. It's part of the process of giving birth that all of our female forebears, have experienced. And it certainly is associated with transformation, with spirituality across cultures and across time.
Mm-hmm. And so you wrote this book in 2000, or it came out in 2009,
Mm,
right? And
yes.
so, we'll definitely get into the topics of oxytocin and the impacts of medical interventions, but like have you seen changes happening from when you wrote the book until to now?
Yeah, that's a
Mhm.
great question, Emily. I mean, if you look at just the bare statistics, all the rates of all of those interventions have become higher. Like, actually, I'm
Mm.
just right now looking at cesareans, and for a paper I'm writing, and like 1 in 5 women around the world in some countries like Turkey, like Brazil, like Iran, have more than 50% rates of cesarean. And in Australia, I just found out it's 38% now. In the US, it's 32%. So
Mm.
we have 1 in 3 women, which is higher than when I wrote the book. Rates of induction, and I think also the pressure on women to have these interventions, from a medical perspective, everyone wants the best outcome for, mothers, babies, fathers, families, everyone, right?
Mhm.
But the medical profession or obstetrics has ended up chasing these smaller and smaller risks, and it's some of what I talk about in the book. And the pressures are even more now, more pressure to have like gestational diabetes testing, group B strep testing, and the benefits are really smaller and smaller, but we're pressuring women and screening like large numbers of women to really prevent very small numbers of problems. So, the net's got tighter, and it's much harder, I think, nowadays to go through the system and come out being low risk. There's so many other filters of risk. So I think that puts more pressure on women. And also the other thing, and certainly since I gave birth, is the pressure on women about going post dates. And again, that's a part of a chapter in my book. And everything I wrote in my book, even though the research hasn't been updated, is really just the same. There's a small increased risk for women who go post dates, but again, we're subjecting a whole lot of women, and especially first time mothers whose gestational length is average 41 weeks. So we're subjecting them to all this pressure about going overdue. I had a friend who gave birth in France, and she said she couldn't have a home birth if she was more than 4 days overdue, which is less than the average for first time
Mm.
mothers. So all of those pressures are so much more on women than they were when I published the book in 2009.
I'm shocked. I mean, that those rates have gone up, but I'm not surprised with the
Yeah.
cesarean rates. And I do hear it all the time. I mean, so my family's I was born in America, but my cousins and stuff, they're all born in Thailand, and they schedule their C-sections. And
Mm,
even when I think of Thailand, it's more, I feel like we're not as westernized. We're supposed to still be rooted in our culture, and maybe more like giving birth at home. You would think it'd be more like that, but it's still very westernized, I guess, in that sense. Like, what are your thoughts on, I mean, why do you think that is, that now people in Thailand are just going straight to the hospital? It's not even a thing to think of home birth.
Well, there's a few reasons for that. And again, if you look globally, like the high cesarean rates are actually in the middle income countries like Thailand. I don't have a number for that, but like China, Iran, some of the smaller European countries have high cesarean rates as well. So that's kind of a phenomenon. And I think there's a few reasons for that. One, if you look at, in fact, some of the figures I just looked at were, if you look at private obstetric care, maternity care versus public, there's generally higher and sometimes much higher rates. Like here in Australia, it was like about 43% private, a bit under 30% public. I just looked at an Italian study where it was in Italy. I'll just get the numbers for you. It was 31% overall, but 68% in private. So when you have a more privatized healthcare system, which I think is part of it in Thailand, then there's a lot of incentive to book women in for cesareans because it just makes the system work better. The private doctors, they've got their clinics, and then if a woman goes into labor, they've got to leave their clinic, reschedule things, go over, look after the woman in labor, maybe go back again. So, physiological birth, spontaneous onset of labor, we don't know when it's going to happen, and it's very inconvenient to systems and to people that schedule systems. So that's another motivation for a cesarean. And in some places there is a higher, the caregivers and the hospitals actually make more money out of cesareans. I hear that that's true in the US, that physiological vaginal birth, especially without an epidural, the hospital doesn't make money on, but the more interventions there are, the more money the hospital makes. So there's those two things. I mean, I think in some places women have been given misinformation that cesarean is safer, and we know that it's not safer for the mother and not safer for the baby in general for healthy low-risk women. But the other reason I think women agree, or it's generally, if you look at that, if you drill down into them, it's not generally that women are asking for cesareans, it's more that the caregiver's suggesting it and women are agreeing with it. So there's not many women that will primarily ask for a cesarean, but they may say yes if they're kind of persuaded a little bit. And that happens in healthcare systems. Oh, your baby's a little bit big. Oh, I'm going to be away. Or, your family could be there. I mean, all these kinds of things. But, the last thing to say is that if you look at women giving birth without a cesarean in the system, it's really not a good experience. Women get a lot of interventions. They get a lot of vaginal examinations. I call it, they get induced. So, normal birth in the system is not such a good experience. So I don't really blame women if they say, gosh, and sometimes women have had a traumatic birth. I don't want to have that again. And the only way I know that I can avoid all of that, including invasive, vaginal examination. You've never been to hospital before. No one's ever put their hand in your vagina except your sexual partner. And suddenly everyone wants to put their hand in your vagina, and it's kind of routine in hospitals, but it's shocking. It's not a positive experience for lots of women. And so given those alternatives of, routine institutionalized birth versus cesarean, some women will choose a cesarean, and who can blame them?
So let's get into, I don't know which one you want to talk about first, which is, the hormonal blueprint, or the impact on medical interventions. But go ahead.
Let's segue into it, because we've got to understand the blueprint before we know the impact of interventions. But I've just described birth in quite a negative way, but that's actually not the way birth is designed to be. So I call it Mother Nature's superb design, and you talked about evolution. I studied anthropology at university, and that's kind of my touchstone. Like, how are we designed? And then how can we optimize things by fitting in with our evolutionary blueprint, or in the terms of what we're talking about, our hormonal blueprint? How can we align ourselves with it and increase ease, pleasure, and safety, as I say, in labor and birth for everyone? And so Mother Nature's superb design is that birth is a positive experience, because Mother Nature wants us to have lots of babies, right? He doesn't want it to be aversive. And you imagine any other animal, and we're talking about kind of mammalian birth here, because it's the processes of labor and birth are common amongst all mammals, and mammals being animals that have mammary glands that suckle their young. And I'm specifically, actually, just in a little detail, I'm talking about placental mammals, so like us, who give birth to large live young and have placentas. And there's a whole lot of other mammals in Australia in particular that marsupials that give birth in a different way. So placental mammals give birth to large live young, and then the young are born in an immature state. Like all placental mammal babies need dedicated maternal care. They can't look after themselves straight away, right? They need species-specific milk, so the mother has to suckle them. And the mother, and that's all of that, as I'm sure all the listeners know, is a big job. Like taking care of small children or babies is a really big job. So Mother Nature provides all these systems to ensure that it happens, because, we as humans, we can have like other motivations. We can even take care of like babies we haven't given birth to. But for other mammals, they have to want to do it. Otherwise, they just walk away. They have to be rewarded and motivated. And actually, what happens through the processes of labor and birth is that the reward and pleasure centers in the laboring female's brain get switched on, so that when she meets her babies for the first time, the sensory information, like the smell of them, the sight of them, the taste of them, most mammals lick their babies, gets connected up, or we say fired and wired, with these reward and pleasure centers. And the mother goes, oh, these are my babies. They're a source of pleasure for me. It feels good to take care of them. And so, they'll give that dedicated care right through to weaning, and they'll take care of their babies, and they'll cut them around and build a nest and all those things that other mammals do. But as humans, we'll invest that time. We'll actually enjoy, to a large extent, taking care of our babies because of that activation of the reward and pleasure centers. And it doesn't mean that you're necessarily going to enjoy all of labor and birth. Like, it's a huge event, right? And there's all kinds of intense things happening. But at the end, when it finishes and you have this incredible activation of the reward and pleasure centers, that's why I call it ecstatic birth. It's designed that you have this euphoria, this ecstasy, this pleasure, as you meet your babies for the first time. So it's designed to be a positive experience. And there's all kind of things that can get in the way of that, which we'll talk about in a minute. And I'll just go on and talk about how oxytocin's part of that. But is there anything you want to comment or ask, Emily?
I just think so I had an unassisted birth with my son, and when I think back on the whole process of labor and then birthing and meeting my son, there definitely wasn't any pain. I feel like pain can be a strong word, but it was just kind of like when you run a marathon or like when you're
intense.
hiking. Yeah, it's intense. It's intense, and it definitely doesn't feel like, as if you really got injured. And I think a lot of women, first-time moms, like, anticipate that. And before I gave birth, I was like, what is it going to feel like? I really wonder. And looking back, it's like, I mean, I would do it all over again. And I felt so ecstatic when my son came out. And yeah, and I don't have experience any other way, right? In what other women may have had in a hospital birth, where they may be drugged up and their senses are kind of dulled and dulled down. So that's just my comment.
Yeah, totally. And when you've experienced it, it's almost, as you say, hard to describe, really. It's like, it's actually, from a hormonal and physiological point of view, it's actually like really good sex. And it's hard to describe what that feels like, right? But in terms of birth, it's the same thing. It's these peaks of oxytocin at that moment of birth or the moment of orgasm that activate the reward and pleasure centers. So like in other mammals, or those 5% of mammals that are monogamous, having sex or mating activates the reward and pleasure centers, which actually instigates bonding to the partner. And it's the same thing. It's oxytocin, hormone of monogamy, as it's called. So yeah, those peaks of oxytocin and other hormones in the brain is what facilitates all of this. And it's hard to describe, because at the same time in labor, as you're having this incredibly intense process and experience, you're also having this reward and pleasure. And the oxytocin that's released during labor inside your brain, which I'll come to in a minute, has a natural pain relieving effect too. So you get the pain and the natural pain relief. You get the intensity and the natural calming of oxytocin. So when you go through, or any animal going through physiological labor and birth, gets all of this hormonal help. Yeah, so called your hormones are your helpers, I sometimes say, in labor. And yeah, just that. I'll talk about oxytocin in a minute, but do you want to say anything about that?
No, but I did see you've done quite a bit of studies on maternal and newborn oxytocin levels and how they respond to synthetic oxytocin. So I was really interested in that, and if you could, I don't know, touch on that now or later, but your
Yeah.
findings in that.
Perfect. Thank you. Yeah. So yeah, out of my own experiences, and especially well, my first baby, who's almost about to turn 33, she was born at home. And when I planned that birth, my neighbor actually had 3 children, and she lent me like a bassinet, like a crib, and I set up the nursery in the other room. And I went into labor and had this beautiful, I call it sweet and oceanic labor and birth. And when my baby was born, no way was I going to put my baby in the next room. Like, I didn't want my
Mm-hmm.
baby more than like an arm's length away from me, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I wondered what happened to my brain. I literally felt my brain change. It was like a 5-hour labor, and my brain was different at the end. And that was kind of like a curiosity for me. What is it that happened that in my brain that made me change that? And of course, in
Mm.
evolutionary terms, it activated all this protectiveness for my baby, because for 65 million years of mammalian evolution, like any mother that put her baby down in the next room, or more than a meter away, the baby wouldn't be there when she turned back, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
a predator would take the baby. So as humans, we have this protective instinct, and our babies have that hardwired as well. They know that if they can't see or feel us, or smell us, or touch us, then they're in danger of their lives. So we have this, like, we could say, virtual umbilical cord, for our small babies when they're very vulnerable. And so the conclusion I came to at that time was that my brain had changed through the peaks of these hormones during labor and birth. And I got really interested in that, and I started writing and talking about the hormones. You can go to my website, sarahbuckley.com, and read my first publication about that, called Ecstatic Birth: Nature's Hormonal Blueprint for Labor, which was actually published in a print magazine called Mothering Magazine in 2002. And then
Mm.
since then, I've kind of built on it. And then I was asked to write a report called The Hormonal Physiology of Childbearing, which I wrote in 2015, which is a massive document. You can go to my website and see that.
Mm-hmm.
And then what came out of that really was, gosh, there's so much we don't know. There's so much we don't know about this. And so I took on doing a PhD to try and fill in some of those research gaps, and also inspire other people to fill in those research gaps. So part of the research I've done in my PhD is this type of research called systematic review. So what you do is you have a methodology, like a kind of net that catches all of the papers published in one particular area that you're interested in. So we looked at studies of when oxytocin levels had actually been measured in women's blood during labor. And we looked at it in terms of women who had no interventions. We actually looked at it during breastfeeding, and now we're doing studies of intervention. So as you say, we've published one on synthetic oxytocin, and I'm currently working on 2, one on epidurals and one on cesareans.
Oh,
So
cool.
yeah, basically, if we want to understand the impact of interventions, we have to know a bit about how oxytocin naturally works. So
Mm-hmm.
as I said, Mother Nature's superb design. So oxytocin, oxy means fast, tocin means birth. So it's discovered first as a hormone that makes birth go fast. And hormone, the word actually means a substance that's made in one part of the body and has effects at another part. So oxytocin is made in the brain, a couple of little areas of the hypothalamus in the brain. It's stored in the pituitary gland, and then it gets released into the body. And in terms of labor and birth, it travels to the uterus. It binds to what's called the oxytocin receptors. These are like the way that hormones work, is by binding to receptors. And it's like putting a key into a lock. You get a specific hormone, a specific receptor, they bind together. and it's like turning a key into a lock that sends a chemical message into the cell. So in this case, oxytocin from the brain to the uterus finds the oxytocin receptors on the outside of the uterine muscle cells, binds to them, turns the lock, sends a chemical message into the cell saying contract. So
Mm.
that's how oxytocin causes a fast birth.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a couple of things to know. One is that, and this was one of the findings from our first paper, when women go into natural or spontaneous or physiological labor, that is, they're not induced, they're very ready for it, and again, if we go back to evolution, like any mammal giving birth in the wild, it's dangerous. It's not safe out there when there's no walls and fences and doors.
Mm-hmm.
So you're very vulnerable to predators. If you've been in labor yourself, it's not very easy to defend yourself in labor. You couldn't fight off a predator.
Right.
So the main safety mechanism for any animal laboring the wild is, first of all, to find a safe place to give birth. And secondly, to activate the fight or flight process to stop labor if things, start to get dangerous, if you have a sense that you're being watched, if you have a sense that you're not feeling safe. And again, for mamas that are given birth out there, you kind of have this sixth sense in labor. You're looking for the safest place. And often that's the smallest room you can find, like the bathroom, and with the smallest number of people. Yeah. I mean, other animals often do have other members of their social groups, like elephants and mice and dolphins have other members of their social group. So it's really the most critical thing to the release of oxytocin is that the laboring female has this sense of safety, a safe, private, safe and unobserved. So the whole thing can't even get off the ground unless the laboring female, and women here too, feel private and safe. And we mentioned a little bit about home birth, and that really explains why women who choose to have their babies at home generally have much, much lower need for intervention, because by definition, you're in your familiar place, you feel private and safe. And like no other animal would leave their private safe place and go somewhere else to give birth, like it wouldn't work for their physiology. And really, it's a tribute to humans, human females, that we can go somewhere else in this strange place with strange noises and strange people and strange smells and even give birth at all, but it also explains why often it's harder. So oxytocin in labor it's critical that the female feels private, safe and unobserved. I'll just
So
stop
is
there for a
this,
minute.
yeah, is this why when a woman goes into labor and goes into the hospital, and instead of just, admitting her into a room and they make her sign papers and then suddenly her labor stops,
Yeah,
is
that's
is that
exactly
she
right.
feels unsafe?
Exactly. And it's not, it's not an intellectual idea. Like you can have, you can be convinced that hospital is the safest place, but this is all happening at a primitive brain level. Your limbic system that releases all of these hormones is kind of scanning, and the presence of strangers, strange smells, like we're picking up with all our senses, the environment is, and our limbic system or our amygdala, even the first port of call is deciding, is this a safe place? And if we don't get that kind of primitive brain yes, which we're unlikely to get in a strange place, then labor can slow down or stop. So, we can come back to this, but if you are giving birth in hospital and you're going to at some point transfer there, you need to look after your limbic system and particularly protect your senses. Some women wear eye masks or, head or have music, headphones, to reduce the sound, having familiar smells like your partner's t-shirt or stuffing your head in a pillow, like the smell of the pillow, like all of these things help to kind of dampen down the limbic system. And of course, the best thing is to actually take someone with you that helps you to feel safe, like your own midwife, like a doula. Really, that's why doula care is so important. And of course, your partner too will help you to feel safe. So yeah, you're exactly right. And in some places, there's actually a name for that. They call it, this is from Monegascan, pasmo. So that sense of going to hospital, everything slowing down and stopping, and even having to come home has been called pasmo in Latin America.
Oh, interesting.
So yeah, so we're not designed to give birth among strangers. So yeah, but anyway, let's presume that we do feel private and safe, and we have this we have this oxytocin being released from the brain, And I think what I went off on a little bit of a tangent there, but what's happening there's a whole process that leads up to this magical moment of the onset of labor. There's a whole lot of preparations that happen, and sometimes I say it's like a royal wedding. Like if William and Kate, and who's the next in line to the throne, if they turned up to get married at Westminster Cathedral like a week before the wedding, it wouldn't be the same, because all the preparations wouldn't be done, and even a day before, even an hour before. And that's really how important all of these changes are, including the last minute changes that we can see in other animal studies. So in part of this preparation for labor and birth is the readiness of the uterus, because again, going back to our evolutionary model, any animal giving birth in the wild is at risk. So we want labor to be as efficient as possible, as short as possible, because the duration of labor is the duration of risk, right? So all these preparations help to make the uterus maximally responsive in labor, have the maximally effective contractions, the most effective pushing stage, so that all happens in as short a duration as possible. And part of those preparations include increased numbers of oxytocin receptors in the uterus. So even small amounts, and that's what we discovered in our research, like the levels of oxytocin at the physiological onset of labor actually quite low, and they don't need to be high because the mama's uterus is so sensitive. And it's not just receptors, there's a whole lot of other preparations that happen as well. And it just reminds me of one of my mentors and friends, Janine Pavati Baker. And when anyone asked, she was a midwife, she was a yogini, she wrote the first book on pregnancy yoga. And she had 6 children, and when anyone asked her how long her labors were, she'd say categorically 9 months. Mm. Mm.
So because sometimes when a woman feels pressure to be induced naturally, which you say in your book is an oxymoron, right? Natural
Yeah,
induction. and
yeah.
and they, I've heard moms talk about, oh, I'll just do castor oil packs if I'm really pushing past 42, just because I don't want to be transferred. Castor oil has terrible side effects. And so, like, if a woman took castor oil, how does that even trigger, the brain to start producing oxytocin, or is it just complete, BS?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So if you go, I suggest people go to my website and look up my epidural blog, and it's got a little picture on it, because that helps to explain the answer to your question. So what happens in labor, and it's the oxytocin system primarily, is that oxytocin is released from the brain, travels to the uterus, binds with the oxytocin uterine receptors, and that causes contractions. And then there's a feedback mechanism, a sensory feedback mechanism, where those sensations of the contractions get fed back to the brain. It's actually an autonomic nerve pathway. And when that information of the pressure, particularly the baby's head on the lower vagina and cervix, all those pressure effects, when that gets fed back to the brain in labor, it tells the brain to release more oxytocin. So the brain releases more oxytocin. We have more to the uterus, more sensations, more sensory feedback, more brain oxytocin release. So it's a positive feedback loop. And it's important to know this when we look at interventions as well. But basically what that means is it fuels what I call a snowball of labor. So labor is a bit like a snowball. It starts small, becomes bigger and bigger, and in the end becomes virtually unstoppable. And the reason for this is because of these feedback loops. And these feedback loops depend on the uterus being ready, being contractible, you could say, which is the oxytocin receptors, as we talked about. There's other mechanisms as well. And I can refer you to actually chapter 2 in my hormonal physiology report goes through all of those pre-labor preparations that happen. But just if we just focus back on oxytocin, so if the uterus is sensitive enough to oxytocin, then this positive feedback loop can get going. And it kind of explains why anything that makes the uterus contract, if the uterus is ready enough, or if the whole system is ready enough, can actually trigger this positive feedback loop. So castor oil, actually releases prostaglandins, which are procontractile, make the uterus contract. Sex or orgasm can sometimes trigger labor. I had an experience where I was actually breastfeeding my eldest when I was pregnant with number 2, and I had an experience where she'd come in at the end of my pregnancy. I just have a little suckle twice a day, and she came in, every morning. That was fine, but the morning I went into labor, she came in and had a little suckle, and I had this most massive contraction. I had to throw her off, literally. Because my uterus was so much more sensitive than the day before, and that contributed to getting me onto that positive feedback loop. So irritating the cervix with catheters. I mean, in the old days I used to actually put little bits of seaweed in to make the cervix open up a little bit, and then kind of irritate it, and that would produce prostaglandins, which would instigate this feedback loop. Stretching and sweeping. There's a whole lot of things that can trigger women into labor if they're ready enough. And that's the key to it. So if castor oil, as you say, it's not a very nice way to enter labor because it makes your bowels really loose, and that's not such a nice thing when you're laboring as well. But if you're ready enough, that those things can just tip the balance as well. But generally, if you're not ready enough, there has to be something more substantial, like prostaglandins, like synthetic oxytocin. Rupturing the membranes also, this is another one of the topics in our systematic review, releases prostaglandins, and that can instigate oxytocin and this positive feedback loop as well. It's a lot of information, isn't it?
Yeah. Okay.
But isn't it a good thing we don't have to know it, because
Yeah.
our bodies know what to do?
Yeah. It's instinctive birth, like you say.
Exactly. Yeah. And the other cool thing about what's happening with this positive feedback loop. So remember I said that the sensations feed back to the brain and tell the brain to release oxytocin. So oxytocin is not just a hormone that makes birth go fast. It's actually released inside the brain as well. And if people have heard about oxytocin as the hormone of love, hormone of monogamy, hormone of trust, like feel-good hormone, that all it relates to the release of oxytocin in the brain. So in the brain, as I mentioned in the beginning, it's calming, it's pain relieving, switches on reward and pleasure centers. So all of these things are happening during labor and birth as this positive feedback loop is going. It's a side effect, you could say, of the positive feedback loop. And what that means, and it's like what you described in your own experience, as labor gets more intense and these contractions become stronger and the feedback is stronger, there's more brain oxytocin release. So it's a perfect, Mother Nature's superb design, a hormonal helper during labor and birth.
Yeah. So maybe we don't really know exactly when, but when does the body start, or our brain start producing the beta endorphins, the natural painkillers?
Yeah, well, oxytocin is related to that system as well. Like oxytocin probably acts by releasing opioids in the brain during labor and birth. So oxytocin has a pain relieving effect, and we think it's probably by secreting opioids as well. So they're all kind of part of the same system, really. And as you said, those opioids, it's not just pain relieving, but it puts us into this altered state of consciousness. And again, if anyone here has had that kind of birth, you kind of know, it's hard to describe what it feels like. One of the Native American tribes, I was told, they say that the laboring woman goes out to the stars to collect the soul of her baby and bring it back. So yeah, part of the processes of labor and birth is this altered state of consciousness that, again, helps to transmute pain. It's like what you described, Emily. It's really intense sensations, but you might not even describe it as pain because of those oxytocin effects in the brain. And I'll just add one more bit to it, which is as the baby's being born, these positive feedback loops are going very strongly. It's been called the Ferguson reflex. It helps to push the baby out as easily and quickly as possible. And again, that's really important for any mammal giving birth in the wild. That's the most dangerous time. But what that means is there's a big peak of oxytocin at that time of pushing the babies out. And I've got to thank the women that had their blood tested at the time they were pushing their baby out. That was a really contribution to the scientific knowledge. But then in the hour after birth, the levels can be even 10 times higher because of the interactions between mothers and babies at that time. So when the baby's skin to skin on the mother's body, which is again in evolution the only place the baby can be, the baby starts to massage the mother's nipple, the baby starts to suckle their hand or fist, and then the baby starts suckling the breast. And all of those things release even more oxytocin for the mother, which helps to contract her uterus and save her life. It switches on the reward and pleasure centers, helps her to bond to her baby, but also it actually has this effect of opening up the blood vessels on her chest wall, which pulse heat to her baby, forming the most the most effective way of keeping the baby warm, like much more effective for the baby to be skin to skin from the mother's body heat and this pulsing mechanism than to put a hat on a baby or put the baby in a crib or put the baby under a warmer. Like the mother's body is just perfect. If the baby's a bit cold, the mother pumps more heat. If the baby's a bit hot, the mother pumps less heat. It's this what's called mutual regulation, really, this kind of magical synchrony between the mother and the baby even after birth.
That's fascinating and completely natural. We are animals.
Yeah, and every mother has that instinct of wanting her baby on her. And some of the most distressing things that women report after birth is if the baby's taken away. And I'll share a funny story. So I was trained in hospital obstetrics or GP, family physician obstetrics. And we were taught when the baby comes out, you take the baby over to the warmer and you give it a little bit of oxygen and you examine it. Like, are they breathing properly? You listen to the heart, like, all the orifices working. And then you give the baby, you sort of, clean the baby off a bit, like sort of sanitize it and give it back to the mother all wrapped up. Then I attended some home births, and the first home birth I attended, I picked up the baby to take it to the warmer, and examine it. And the mother said, "What are you doing?" And I thought, oh, that's right. The baby belongs to the mother, not to the doctor. Oh yeah, and that's the instinct of every mammalian mother, including humans, is to have our babies with us skin to skin as much as possible in that hour after birth. And I don't know if you're aware of this World Health Organization program called the Baby Friendly Hospital Initiative,
No.
which hospitals can get certified as baby friendly. And there's 10 steps of baby friendly that are all designed to optimize breastfeeding. And one of those steps is have mother and baby skin to skin as soon as possible after birth for at least an hour. So that not just has all those benefits we've talked about, but it also gives them optimal start to breastfeeding because, the mother's in this, she's got these peaks of oxytocin, she's calm, she's relaxed, she's got this reward and pleasure center. And the baby, actually, that was a finding we've had from some of our other systematic reviews, is the baby has this massive release of oxytocin during labor and birth, and the levels are actually higher in the baby than the mother. So we have this perfect synchrony of the mother, happy, relaxed, euphoric, ready to socialize and connect, the baby in exactly the same situation. They come together, and I say it's like the best first date ever. Yeah, they're primed to fall in love with each other, which is species survival. That's why we're all here.
Oh yeah. Well, if the mom and the baby didn't like each other, that wouldn't make sense at all. We want to love
Exactly.
our
Yeah.
own babies.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's designed to kick in as soon, straight after birth. And it, like some people say that didn't happen for them. Often that's because of some disruption in the oxytocin system. So maybe we could segue on to talking about that, unless you've got any other comments or questions.
Well, if any first-time moms are listening here, if if they can just trust their bodies that birth, if you can trust that the opioids from the oxytocin, is going to not really have you feel any pain necessarily. I mean, I wouldn't say all births are pain free, right? But if women could just trust their bodies in what is given to them during labor and birth, then no drugs or I need an epidural, take me now would be necessary.
Yeah, and I think it's also, helping women to feel private, safe, and unobserved. And if you think about traditional systems of maternity care, what we did before medical care came along, was really focused on the emotional well-being of the laboring woman, making sure she feels safe, making sure she feels private. So we kind of knew that back then, but somehow that's
Mm.
fallen to the bottom of the priority list in modern times. So, that's why, as I said, doulas, having your own midwife. And the other part of it, I just want to emphasize, for the whole birthing family, for a partner that's there, it's important to know that she's not going to be her normal self. She could, swear at you. She could,
Mm-hmm.
and that's really important. It's really important. Or as Anna Mae Gaskin said, if a woman doesn't feel like a queen in labor, someone's not treating her right. Like, she should
Mm.
be the center of everything. What she says goes. If she doesn't want someone in the room, it's really, really important that that person gets out. It's really important
Mm-hmm.
that what makes her feel private and safe is gonna help her to have her baby as quickly and easily as possible. And sometimes in labor, I don't know if you had this experience, but unresolved emotional things can come up, to do with sexuality, to do with previous birth, to do with relationships, especially with your own mother. And again, having caregivers that understand that can help you with that. Sometimes, I don't know if you've had this, but in the middle of labor, sometimes you just need a good cry or a
Mm-hmm.
bit of a whinge, and that can actually progress you. You get stuck and things aren't moving, and then you go, oh my God, this, and then you have a cry or a sob or a rest, and then it gets moving again. Natural labor has these ebbs and flows that, again, the medical system doesn't really understand or take account of. So, yeah, really good to have someone in the space that can help to facilitate all of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And hold that space for the mom.
Exactly,
Mm-hmm.
exactly. Yeah, so as I just going back to the beginning, because we don't have a system that's really set up to accommodate these basic needs of laboring women, as Michelle O'Don talks about, we've got to add in our own things, have our own doula, have our partner who can support us. And I would say, actually, stay home as long as possible, because what happens with this snowball of labor that I described, it does become bigger and bigger and bigger, and in the end become virtually unstoppable. So going into hospital at the end of labor, when all these feedback loops are really very strongly embedded, your labor is much less likely to get disrupted. You're much less likely to have PASMO, as we talked about. But sometimes that stress of going into hospital can actually trigger a fast labor. And again, in the wild, if you imagine a laboring female, and a predator turns up at the end of labor, it's too late to slow everything down. You probably can't do it. So it makes much more sense for her to birth her baby quickly and easily, grab her
Mm-hmm.
baby and run away. So that's been called the fetus ejection reflex, where that kind of bit of fear, bit of adrenaline at the end of labor can actually trigger a labor and birth. And women may have experienced this, where they go to hospital and they have their baby in the lift, or just as they get in, or in the car park or something like that, because of that extra stress that
Mm-hmm.
triggers a labor and birth. So that's all Mother Nature's superb design, as I call it.
Hmm. So can we, yeah, start to talk about, is that everything with oxytocin?
Yeah. There might be other bits and pieces that I'll bring in later. But yeah, so you can see there that it's kind of a whole package, private, safe and unobserved, good support through labor, skin to skin afterwards, undisturbed birth, basically. So, one of the problems, as I mentioned, is that we don't provide those circumstances. We generally disturb birth. And as I say in my book, when birth is not going well, we disturb it even more. So it's kind of a bit ironic, really. But so going into hospital, if you that is an intervention. And there's a great World Health Organization obstetrician called Marsden Wagner, and he said the first intervention is when the woman walks outside of her house to go
Mm-hmm.
to hospital. And it's true, it is actually true physiologically in the body, which is not to say that everyone should have their babies at home, but what it means is that if there's what I call a hormonal gap, things that should happen are not happening, and you've got to fill that in. And as I said, my hints for that is, like, protect your senses, protect your sight, your smell, your hearing, protect yourself from that strange institution. Take familiar people with you, so you can really have a smooth transition, and ideally go at the end of labor when the snowballs unstoppable. Yeah, so have
Mm-hmm.
your own doula, midwife, or someone on the end of the phone that can help you to figure that out. So yeah, going into hospital is the first intervention, and then, what happens in hospital, often, as we said, labor slows down or even stops. And then we start doing things to make labor speed up again, like synthetic oxytocin. And synthetic oxytocin is interesting what we found out in this review we did, because before that I was kind of convinced it was going to cause all these brain problems for the mother and the baby. But what we actually found out is when it's given to women in labor, the doses are really very low. You can't give much to women in labor because you'd cause contractions that would endanger the baby.
Mm-hmm.
So levels are kind of 3 to 4 times higher than natural levels. And that's not enough to cross into the brain of the mother. It's not enough to cross to the baby. So according to these numbers, which are kind of irrefutable, really, like it doesn't cause problems to the baby's brain. It doesn't cause autism. It doesn't directly cause depression or those kind of things in the mother. And it doesn't stop the mother's release of oxytocin. And in fact, if we go back to our feedback loop, if it causes stronger contractions, anything that causes stronger contractions can get this feedback loop going and actually increase oxytocin in the brain. So
Okay.
we don't think that that's a problem either. But there are certainly, and I refer you to the paper that we wrote, which has a very long introduction and discussion about this and a nice picture. Basically, what happens is it causes contractions that are stronger and closer together than the woman would naturally have. They're not actually longer, they're just stronger and closer together. So the relative gap between contractions is shorter. So it puts more stress on the mother's system. And we think that this extra stress could kind of counteract the oxytocin. So oxytocin is like an anti-stress hormone, yeah, and it puts you into the kind of anti-stress physiology in your body, the parasympathetic nervous system. And we think that too much synthetic oxytocin kind of does the opposite of that and could put the woman into a stress system. And it's not a pleasant experience. And even if she's not feeling pain, even if she's got an epidural, that extra physiological stress could kind of shift her out of the oxytocin. And there are some suggestions that that might be the case, but we don't have direct evidence. That's our current working model for that. But for the baby, these stronger, closer together contractions, the baby doesn't have the time to recover in between. So it's definitely a stress for the baby. There's lots and lots of studies showing, babies can be in worse condition. They're more likely to go to NICU. They can have encephalopathy, some more severe changes, because we're just, some babies can cope with that extra stress, but some babies can't. So it is an extra stress for the baby as well. And again, it's, counteracting that calm and connection, euphoria, kind of oxytocin effect. So we think that that is the main problem with synthetic oxytocin.
And so in a hospital setting, there really is, if there was no time, like no clock in a hospital, hospitals really wouldn't need to administer synthetic oxytocin.
Yeah, that's a good point, Emily. There was a wonderful childbirth educator called Sheila Kitzinger from the UK, and a quote from her, she says, "The clock is an unevaluated piece of obstetric technology."
Mm-hmm.
Because it's kind of where it all starts, right? There's suddenly
Mm-hmm.
this push, the calendar, you've got to give birth by a particular time, the clock, you've got to, dilate at a particular rate. And yeah, physiology doesn't do that. Like, not every baby walks at 1 year old. You know what I mean? Like other processes don't adhere to strict time scales. So it's kind of artificial to expect labor to do that. And, that's what's so nice about, low technology models of care, where you have your own freedom, you're at home, you have your own midwife, or you don't have anyone, no one's really tied to the clock in that way. So that the other problem with synthetic oxytocin, just going back to that, is because it causes these stronger, closer together contractions for the laboring woman, it's more painful, and she's more likely to need pain relief, and especially an epidural. So those two things often go together. So the epidural really does have significant hormonal impacts, whether it's with synthetic oxytocin or not. So the problem with the epidural is it's so effective at pain relief. Like for most women, it's like 90 to 100% relief of pain. The sensations go away. And if we go back to our positive feedback loop, and you might have to look at the little diagram on my website, on my epidural blog for this, it basically stops the sensory, the input to that feedback loop. So the sensations from the uterus that are conducted up to the brain, that tell the brain to release more oxytocin, get cut off, get disrupted. So the brain stops, slows down, or even stops releasing oxytocin when women have an epidural, which means that labor often slows down or stops. So if they don't have synthetic oxytocin already, they're probably given it to make labor start up again. But the other problem is that if we go back to our feedback loop again, that is responsible for increasing brain oxytocin. So women with an epidural also get a deficit in these, all of these positive brain effects like pain relieving, like calm and connecting, like switching on reward and pleasure centers. And in fact, when they've given epidurals to animals, sheep and cows, they don't bond with their babies because they don't have that peak of oxytocin. So I'm not saying you won't bond with your baby if you get an epidural, but what I am saying is there's a hormonal gap there that we need to consider. So epidurals cause, yes, they can be helpful in some circumstances, like no intervention is useless, like I'm not anti-intervention at all, but we need to be aware that there's consequences of that, and particularly hormonal consequences for the oxytocin system.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so synthetic oxytocin is administered, then the woman gets an epidural. What's the next intervention that could
Yeah,
lead
well,
after that?
yes, because the epidural slows down her oxytocin release, which is compensated to some extent by synthetic oxytocin, our positive feedback loop slows down or stops, and she doesn't have that burst of oxytocin to push her baby out. So often in those circumstances, she's more likely to have a long pushing stage and or to need some help like forceps or vacuum extraction. Or the other scenario is that extra stress from the synthetic oxytocin on the baby can cause fetal distress, or I can talk about that in a minute, but basically signs that the baby doesn't have enough oxygen, doesn't have enough replenishment time in between contractions, and that can stress the baby. The baby gets hypoxic. That shows low oxygen levels. That shows up on the fetal heart rate monitor, and nothing is working. So the woman needs a cesarean. So it does increase the risk of cesareans for fetal distress. So yeah, that's kind of the cascade of intervention, really. And you can imagine a cesarean has all of these hormonal consequences. If it's a pre-labor cesarean where, elective cesarean, the mother hasn't even started labor, she doesn't have the preparation, she doesn't have the in-labor processes, she has a really big hormonal gap. If she has it an in-labor cesarean, then she's going to miss out on those late labor peaks of oxytocin. And, we think that they're really important for switching on the reward and pleasure centers. This is interesting, a couple of things. Those labor peaks of oxytocin also in some way that we don't understand actually help the mother's body to release oxytocin during skin-to-skin contact, because the studies that have been done show that when women have a pre-labor cesarean, so no labor at all, and then their baby's skin to skin, and then they actually don't release oxytocin or don't release significant amounts of oxytocin in that circumstance. Whereas a woman who's been through physiological labor can have a 10 times higher increase in oxytocin in that circumstance. So there's another hormonal gap there in that that skin-to-skin oxytocin release that we don't really understand. So definitely, if you have a cesarean, have your baby skin-to-skin on you afterwards. But basically, with these hormonal gaps, as I call them, the whole processes of labor and birth and all the preparation leading up to that produces this perfect moment, this window of opportunity. So you could have, as I had with my last baby, an hour and a half labor and everything kicks in. But if you miss that window of opportunity because of a pre-labor cesarean or an induction, then you're going to have to work harder. Yeah, the processes aren't primed. Yeah, so the benefits you might get from, say, an hour skin to skin with your baby after physiological labor and birth, and your oxytocin levels go up 10 times. You've got to do hours or maybe even days of skin to skin with your baby following a pre-labor cesarean to get those same benefits. And for the baby as well. I haven't talked about the baby very much, but there's a whole process during labor and birth that kind of wakes the baby up. It's an outpouring of adrenaline and noradrenaline, the catecholamine surge. So the baby is ready to be born, ready to make that like miraculous adjustment to life outside the womb. And the baby born by pre-labor cesarean doesn't get any of that preparation. So It's a bit like someone coming in the middle of the night and shining a bright light in your eyes and taking the bedclothes off you and getting you out of bed. You're just not ready for it. So again, for the baby, the baby has hormonal gaps as well. And just to give it in a really short way, the way to fill in those hormonal gaps in any of these situations is skin to skin, as early as possible for as long as possible, and breastfeeding, because both of those things release oxytocin and help to fill in those hormonal gaps.
Thank you for sharing all of that and the benefits of having skin to skin contact immediately or within the hour. So if a woman, I feel like a lot of my listeners are more on the crunchy side, but what if we, what if we did just share this information with someone and they're just like, okay, I don't think any mom instinctually would say none of that matters, right? I think every mom deep down wants easy breastfeeding, easy, happy, content baby. But bluntly, if a mom or someone were to say, why should I care what happens after birth? How could you bluntly say, well, kind of what you just said, right? Like, don't you want to have your baby enter this world? Like, what would you say to that if someone said, why should I care?
Well, I think that one of the big arguments is it gives the mother a much easier transition. Like if you have a cesarean, you're recovering from major abdominal surgery at the same time as looking after a newborn baby. Like those are both huge jobs, as you know. So for the mother, all of this hormonal help really facilitates that transition to her for motherhood. And similarly for the baby, all the hormonal changes for the baby help to facilitate the transition for the baby smoothly to life outside the womb.
Mm-hmm. And would you say that the correlation with postpartum depression is related to what happens in this moment?
Look, those are really difficult questions. They're really important questions, Emily, and they're hotly debated. Yeah, I think they're also the other problem is we have not just postpartum depression, but we also have post-traumatic stress disorder. And some women come out of the kind of births that we give, in our maternity care system with post-traumatic stress disorder, about 6% in most studies around the world, which is actually higher than combat veterans. So we're not providing a safe space for a lot of women to give birth. So that's really important to know that it's not just the circumstances of birth and all of these hormones, but sometimes what actually happens in birth to the most intimate parts of a woman's body can actually trigger post-traumatic stress. So there's a debate in there. Is it post-traumatic stress? Is it postpartum depression? But just going back to first principles, all of these hormones are designed to feel good so that birth feels good, so that the mother feels good after the birth, so that she bonds with her baby. And by the way, we talked a little bit about skin to skin after birth. If you think in evolutionary terms, like there's nowhere else for the baby to be, right? That's safe except skin to skin on the mother for the early months. So skin to skin contact, even after birth in the first month, has been shown to reduce the risk of or reduce the scores of postpartum depression, actually. So the baby is a natural antidepressant, we could say. And then all the hormones of breastfeeding reduces postpartum depression. So you could say indirectly that physiological birth increases your chance of successfully breastfeeding compared to cesarean, and that reduces your risk of postpartum depression. But, I just think instinctively that feeling euphoric, ecstatic, proud of yourself after the birth is really the best possible start we can have. And if we don't get that, there's a hormonal gap and we need to do all the things we can to fill it in.
Oh, so is there anything else you wanted to touch on with the impacts of medical intervention?
Yeah, I mean, it's like what you said, Emily. I just think, our bodies are so superbly designed. So it's really about trusting your body, trusting your baby, trusting birth, and also being smart about the choices that you make. So I say to women, choose a low technology model of care, choose a home birth, choose a midwife, choose a birth center, because you can always go up to the next level. You can get extra help if you need it, but once you've enrolled in that high technology model of care, you can't turn up in hospital and go, oh, actually, I'd like to have a home birth.
Mhm.
And the systems of care that we have are generally safe in whatever circumstance you're in. Like if you start off at home and something happens, you can go to hospital and get the care that you need. So, studies show that home birth and hospital birth generally have the same rates of safety for the baby, and actually home birth is safer for the mother because her chance of cesarean is so much lower, under 10% generally, versus all those figures we talked about, 30% or more. And cesarean is major abdominal surgery, hemorrhage, infection, blood clots, all of those things are much more likely. So yeah, choose a low technology model of care and trust your body, trust your baby, trust birth.
When a woman gives birth, whether it's at home or in a hospital, and they really don't want to get pitted in their leg to stop the hemorrhage, is there a way to, would you say, a way to avoid that would just be having your baby skin to skin, so then your uterus can contract and like what you said earlier?
Yeah, that's exactly it. That's exactly it. So, through millions of years of evolution, that's how we're designed. We're designed to have our babies skin to skin. And this, as I call it, mutual regulation, the baby's interactions increase the mother's oxytocin, and the mother oxytocin keeps the baby warm. And, there's some kind of, that we don't really understand, subtle way as well, that these interactions between the mother and baby enhance the initiation of breastfeeding. So, yeah, and then the breastfeeding releases oxytocin as well. Actually, it's interesting, one study that was done on this that actually measured oxytocin levels every 15 minutes
Mhm.
in relation to what the baby did in skin to skin was actually the baby's early hand massage of the mother's breast that released the most oxytocin. So
Mhm.
you didn't even need to breastfeed it, just for the baby to be on there and to be able to enact their instinctive behaviors. So yeah, that's certainly, and we are getting some research around that showing that for women with low risk and no interventions in labor and birth, that is as effective as having an injection of pitocin, synthetic oxytocin. But that might not apply if you've had other interventions like epidural, cesarean, synthetic oxytocin in labor.
If you had to share words of wisdom to a first-time mom, pregnant or has just entered motherhood, what would you want to say to her?
Yeah, I think the most important thing is to recognize that this is a really big job that you're doing. So in our culture, we don't really support or recognize the beauty and the importance of pregnancy, of birth, of mothering. So find your tribe, find those people that do recognize and support you, whether it's family or friends or a natural birth community. And yeah, start with a low a low technology model, and you can move up if needed, and look after yourself and trust your body.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, beautiful. Thank you, Emily.
I appreciate you taking the time to talk with us on mother freedom.
Yeah, my pleasure. My pleasure.